Hello and welcome. This is a video on the four main categories of biotechnology. This is a book which these are four categories which I'm taking from Fukuyama's book, Our Post-Human Future. Really recommend anyone interested in this topic of biotechnology to get this book. It's kind of like a foundational text nearly for thinking about this stuff. There's lots of texts out there which you don't think are related to this topic, but actually are related to this topic. But this is just like a very clear cut, well written, simple, understandable, decent text written in published in 2002. And it's Fukuyama at his best when he's not talking about the end of history. Is when Fukuyama's at his best. So, well, this is related to the end of history, obviously too, but anyway, whatever. Let's not get into that. So these are the four categories, and I thought I would just run through them because I do talk a lot about the political consequences of biotechnology and the kind of ontological issues which biotechnology bring up. But it's good to just go over like some of the main categories. To be kind of more practically aware of the particular forms that this is taking and could take, which so let's just go through them. So there's four, right? There's brain sciences, there's neuropharmacology and behavioral control, there's the prolongation of life, and there's genetic engineering. We tend to think, when we think about technology, of genetic engineering because it's the most extreme and obviously the most dangerous. If you can, we're going to go through genetic engineering, but the more dystopian visions of the world, things you're going to see in films and so on, things which we're going to be most threatened by and offended by, are generally going to be in the genetic engineering category. But this is just one of these other categories, and these other categories are in some way building blocks for this more dangerous category. So it's all very important to understand. Okay, so the first one is brain sciences. Brain sciences is very relatable to genomics. Genomics is the study of the genes, DNA, on a kind of molecular micro level. I'm not a scientist, as you can probably tell, but you don't need to be to understand this stuff on a basic philosophical and political level. By the way, you don't need to understand in scientific detail, but so the study of how genes relate to each other, what causes what, and this also relates a lot to the Human Genome Project, which I think probably motivated Fukuyama to write this book in the first place, or at least put him on to this topic. And the Human Genome Project is a project I think began in the United States. I think sometime in the 90s. I'm not 100% sure. You have to look that up. But I think it's an attempt, probably an ongoing attempt. Well, it's definitely ongoing. Whether it's ongoing by this specific organization is another question. But it was the first attempt, basically, to use computational computer information technology to try further understand the DNA sequencing, on a kind of almost like on a mathematical level. So it's basically a breakthrough in using information technology to understand kind of microbiology in greater detail. So when you think of something like mapping the brain, we kind of hear this to do with artificial intelligence. If we could map the brain, we could simulate human intelligence, as opposed to just having AI, which is extremely intelligent and sophisticated, but it's not human intelligence, right? I'm not saying like this is possible. By the way, I don't know if it is or not, right? But I have my doubts. But the point is, this is often when we think of genetic engineering or mapping the brain and so on, this goes back to the study of genomics, and it's kind of historically important to think about this originating with the Human Genome Project. So something that's worth looking into. So obviously Fukuyama, so we need to understand that like what's worrying here isn't just the technology, but it's also the research. So Fukuyama will talk about how the furthering field of something like genomics and the further understanding of how genes influence and cause and relate to our behavior is going to very much disrupt a lot of what more typically liberal values. And I think that this is the point of his book in a way. He's trying to show how things like moral agency could be very much disrupted by understanding things like this more. So, for example, even if you could argue, so he'll talk about intelligence, for example, if genetic influence of intelligence, which is an extremely controversial topic, and I understand completely why it's an extremely controversial topic, because it's being misused so much by people who are extremely ideological in many ways. But this doesn't matter when, well, not that it doesn't matter, but it shouldn't be used as an excuse to not have to think about like what happens when our ability to understand genetic influence increases. So, for example, even if you could end up arguing more and more concretely that something like intelligence was influenced even like 30%, for example, by genes, even if it's still like heavily influenced by environment, even if it was just like 30%, that's still a big disruption. That 30% is still a large disruption. And by the way, I'm not saying that you can. I don't really know. I'm suspicious of what people mean by intelligence. Like, I'm very, anti-scientism. So I'm not trying to say like, oh yeah. All this stuff about environment is just a bunch of like liberal nonsense. Like, no, I don't think it is. But nonetheless, the increase in understanding genetic causation is going to be very disruptive to our ethical and political life. For example, our legal systems, you could even imagine a situation, even from a very progressive point of view, you could imagine a situation where it's argued, where genetic causation is actually exaggerated so that you can say this person is in some sense being victimized by the justice system because you're trying to hold them morally responsible for their crime or for doing something very immoral. And there's an exaggeration of genetic causation for their behavior, which can be used to obviously indulge certain behaviors and exempt people from legal accountability, moral accountability, and so on. So the furthering of this study is going to be disruptive from both sides. One good example, actually, because I see this phrase coming up more and more now. At the moment, it's more from the right, but you can infer this also. Like, you could perceive the left having a problem with this as well in given certain contexts. Low impulse control, right? So we often see a attempt to, I think, cheaply explain away certain human behaviors by saying this group of people or that individual has very low impulse control, right? And you could imagine a gene for the argument that there's some sort of genetic causation for low impulse control. And even if this could be understood in some sort of crude way, even if it's not really accurate, but even if it's a very crude way, you can imagine the effect that would have on our concepts of justice, because our enlightened democratic liberal constitutional kind of idea of law is very much based on the idea of moral agency, and these sorts of research really do undermine a lot of. On one hand, they could undermine our understanding of equality, and could undermine our attempts to sort of politically and socially make things more equal, from a more right-wing perspective. And it also could be used from a more progressive perspective to undermine the justice system itself by indulging anyone from having any sort of moral agency and so on. Fukuyama will point out that we're actually very inconsistent in how we think about this. So, for example, the right will think about homosexuality as something which is more conventional, more of a choice. But it's more likely to think of intelligence as being more genetically influenced, where the left is the complete other way around. It's very reluctant to say intelligence could be in any way caused by genetic inheritance, but it's very, very reluctant to say that homosexuality is in any way a choice. So that's one kind of contradiction that he'll observe. So the second category is neuropharmacology and behavior control. He's basically going to talk here, and this was written in 2002, by the way. So he's talking a lot about Ritalin and Prozac, and this is an interesting category to think about, because this is very alive. Like, this isn't in the future. This isn't like dystopian potential. This is very, very, very present, and it's been very present for a number of decades. It's not even specifically in the past 5, 10, 15 years. It's been like the SSRI revolution was in the 70s or something. I think it was the 70s. There's a danger. So Fukuyama will talk about the dangers of using drugs like this to sort of give people. So, for example, having low serotonin levels can be, which is the chemical, which people who are depressed normally have low serotonin levels. Now, I'm not saying they're depressed because they have low serotonin levels. They could easily have low serotonin levels because they're depressed. But Fukuyama will argue that, like, in how we deal with this problem, our serotonin levels are very much related to our sense of social value and kind of self-esteem, which is self-esteem is the kind of pop psychology term, but whatever. How we value ourselves, and Fukuyama, being very Hegelian in a lot of ways, obviously knows that our consciousness, our self-understanding, is very social. It's very reflexive, and our sense of, so he'll talk about serotonin levels in chimpanzees, that there's, if the higher up the pecking order you are, often the higher serotonin level the animal will have. And there is something, obviously, like, human social orders are not in any way as simple as and reducible to anything like an animal, even smart animals like chimps. But nonetheless, we are still biological creatures, and we still do have serotonin levels. And the way we value ourselves within society is related to that feeling and related to that chemical phenomena. So he'll talk about the particularly American tendency to believe we're entitled to happiness, right? So giving people pills, we can sort of redistribute this feeling of success, of self-worth, of self-esteem to people through medicine, when instead it should be something people kind of work for or earn or struggle with. And this is obviously related to the idea of thymos as well, which is the ancient Greek term corresponding to pride, recognition, and so forth. This is actually really interesting, because it relates very much to the managerial therapeutic state, which someone like Paul Gottfried or Christopher Lasch or Philip Reef will discuss in one form or another. Philip Reef will discuss a therapeutic society where happiness is not the byproduct of a higher goal. Happiness is the higher goal. It's those feelings are the end, not a byproduct of an end. Paul Gottfried will talk about the managerial therapeutic state, trying to redistribute self-esteem to marginalized groups. So this or that group is marginalized. There's a move away from the old economic redistribution to the redistribution of recognition of success, of social value. And now the point Fukuyama is kind of making here is that you can't really redistribute this other than in a very vulgar kind of mechanical, chemical way. Because this is something that needs to be worked for or earned. This is kind of what this is. And if you don't work and earn for it, you obviously have to ask the question, is it really worth anything? Is cheap self-esteem, which is handed to you in a bottle, really self-esteem proper, right? And he brings up history. Would there be a Napoleon if Napoleon could just be satisfied more safely by taking Prozac? So he'll talk about the very thoughtless categories of behavior and character. Everything becomes a diagnostic problem. This is very relatable to Ivan Illich as well. His work on modern medicine and what modern medicine is trying to do, what modern medicine is, and so forth. I very much recommend his work as well. Again, this kind of falls into this kind of post-liberal treating people as if they're totally not responsible for their actions, as if they're these completely helpless beings that are completely helpless, and the only way that they can ever achieve any sort of improvement in their self-esteem or in their health and so on is by having some sort of medical authority give them this. So he'll also talk about the androgenizing effect of Ritalin and Prozac. So for example, I mentioned serotonin levels, right? Kind of alpha male chimps will have very high serotonin levels. High serotonin levels is very much related to kind of exaggeratedly masculine behaviors. And the most frequent users of SSRIs tend to be women, right? So you've got all these women taking these, and this kind of makes sense in the kind of corporate workplace world where women are constantly comparing themselves to men and trying to compete against men, right? You have this this kind of androgenizing of women into having these very, very high serotonin levels because these pills are taking, giving them more male characteristics. And on the other hand, you have young boys who he points out aren't meant, they're just by nature. It's very clear that young boys, and I'd be in this position as a young boy. Trust me, I understand this. Sitting in a classroom, for hours and hours a day, staring at a chalkboard, looking at a textbook. When as a young boy you should be running around and doing things with your hands and so on and so forth. The boys that are the highest, young boys and school age boys are the highest consumers of Ritalin, which is designed to help you concentrate, and is related to things like cocaine as well, by the way. I'm pretty sure Ritalin is basically just legal cocaine. So making young boys less like young boys, making women less like women. There's this androgenizing effect, which is going on with the kind of neuropharmacological behavior control. And I'll point out too, and this is obviously a very good point, this isn't just some sort of Orwellian problem of authority forcing this upon completely helpless victims, but the authorities here can be parents, it can be teachers, and they don't have to have some evil conspiratorial desire to like seriously hurt anyone. They can just be lazy and incompetent and unthoughtful. And it's easier to give little boys pills, um, uh, you know, um, uh, rather than try kind of adapt an education system which is better suited to which is better suited to their nature and so on. Same with giving people, SSRIs when they have extremely low self-esteem. And I'm not trying to say that just because people take SSRIs is because they all have low self-esteem. They could have much more complicated issues, and then it also leads to similar problems when they take SSRIs. But in general, there could be a vulgar use of these SSRIs for people. And this is very much a kind of just a kind of consumer management of your own happiness, nearly, rather than an authentic dealing with happiness in a much more complicated and nuanced and sophisticated way. So the problem isn't just Orwellian, dictators. It's very much a problem of kind of medicine as a consumer item, and of parents and teachers and psychologists just being lazy and incompetent. Okay, so the third category, the prolongation of life. And I think this is actually probably one of the most relevant categories pertaining to the past few years with lockdowns and so on. I use this funny Guardian headline, which is a very good example of this kind of gerontocracy propaganda. The gerontocracy obviously means rule by the old. And do other people lose interest in sex? 10 myths of aging. This, this is kind of a side note, but the boomers really, really brought this forward. Like, the boomers really have never accepted aging as as a thing which is natural and inevitable. They've really been the first generation in history. I'm not saying they're the only generation in history, but they really were the first generation in history to truly reject the idea of aging. And I think this headline here is pretty evident of that. So Fukuyama will talk about not only the biotechnological, engineering you could imagine with like reverse aging or something, which could make people live till they're like 150, for example. But there's already a problem with this even before that technology comes in, with demographic shifts where the median age goes way up, people not having kids and people living longer, an aging society, and so on and so forth. He points out that the way things are going by 2050, and this was written in 2002, by the way, so by the way things are going, by 2050, the median age in Germany could be 54 and Japan 55, and in some countries even higher. Like the average age could be 55. That's insane. He also points out, I can't remember the exact number, but he pointed out like that in a society, a kind of pre-modern medicine society, the average age was like 20 something, so the effects of having a society where the average age is 55 are pretty incredible. Obviously, one issue is economic. There's not enough young people to pay for this massive aging population, and the aging population then begin to kind of drain the society, taking from it far more than they give to it in their life. So, and you don't have to think of this just as economic, by the way. I'll get into that once I finish this, but I want to talk a little bit about the kind of nature of the lockdowns and so on as well. So, for example, he says women live longer than men in general. So this is an even bigger problem with the kind of feminization of politics, and this will have big effects for military. Men and women generally have very different views on military, and labor in particular. Men and women have very different views on what kind of labor is good or bad. It obviously brings up a lot of quality of life versus quantity of life, and this is very relevant for if you get into the actual kind of reverse aging technology if we can imagine that being possible, where it's like a question of, well, do you want to live, like, do you want to like reverse age when you reach like 70 and then live till you're like 130 and live 50 years as like an 80-year-old? Is that worth living? There's have to be a certain argument for the quality of life and not just the quantity of life. And then obviously the ability to kind of put off death, um, somewhat indefinitely, it would mean that people can no longer face death with any sort of courage or dignity anymore. It becomes a medical problem. It becomes something to treat rather than something to confront. It can affect the intellectual shifts in society. So he was saying that the people getting older and dying has always been a product of value and intellectual changes in the dominant opinions and values of a society. I think like if you think of someone like Nancy Pelosi or Dianne Feinstein, who are like they literally must be like 100 fucking, like I'm pretty sure that both of them are literally like late 80s or even like early 90s, who are still in government. And you can think of a lot of institutions, especially institutions that deal with our intellectual and moral life, academia, media, publishing, and so on, that could have older people hanging on to positions of authority there for longer and longer and longer, and then transitions in our intellectual and moral and social life become very much stagnant. And I think that has happened, even though we've had even though like something like wokeness is it's sort of novel in certain ways. Like transhumanism is novel in certain ways. There is an argument to be made that things like transhumanism and wokeness are also the products of a stagnant society, where there hasn't been a transition from the neoliberal boomer technocrats, their power and their authority over our kind of cultural, intellectual life and political life, hasn't transitioned into something which can actually address the problems which are emerging and which can overcome the limitations and failures of that generation. They sort of hang on to things in a certain way. And then I think that the wokeness and the transhumanism is a consequence of that, rather than wokeness and transhumanism being a product of exaggerated change. I think it is an argument to be made that it's a product of stagnation as well. A stagnation which causes a certain change. But anyway, so I think that even if you look at like the lockdowns, you can see this, because the lockdowns were very much made for old people, even though actually a lot of old people who were in old people's homes actually ended up dying in the early stages of the virus. But those are poor old people, like wealthy old people, is who we're talking about here. Wealthy old people. The crisis was responded to, I think, in many ways, by people who clearly do see quantity of life as being more important than quality of life, clearly don't look at children and look at the next generation as being in any way hopeful and worth much. It's kind of clawing and holding on to power. If you think of Biden and like this hysteria around Trump and this kind of gerontocracy, it really did reveal itself in a very, very almost a vampiric way over the past few years, I would argue. I do think we're increasingly responding to crises and creating politics which is designed actually by and for affluent elderly people who don't appreciate cultural historical transitions in their proper sense. That's a whole different topic. I could talk about it for hours. Anyway, so let's go on to the last final section. Genetic engineering. So genetic engineering is the more like typical full-on technological intervention and so on, often irreversible. Because I know like pharmacological is still an intervention on a chemical level, but I suppose it's quite reversible because you can just stop taking the pill. But if you think about wiring our brains, or if you think about like manipulating the genes of an embryo, or cloning or something like this, you can't. These aren't very reversible things. These aren't things you can just fix by stopping taking something, taking a chemical supplement. These are things which are much more long term. So, this is the more extreme category, and Fukuyama will say that all of this is very much these more extreme technological interventions will be very much dependent on the development of information technologies, in particular things like genomics and bioinformatics, which is another field of study, which are basically contingent on the increasing computational and screening technologies which can trace gene causations, interactions, DNA sequencing, and all that. The more mapping and tracing that can be done, the more we know about causal influences, etc., the more likely certain technologies will actually be used. Because, for example, like no one's going to go in messing around with like a human, embryo, which is going to be an actual baby, or just a living human being, on a genetic level, if they don't really understand it. But the more and more you understand it, like the safer, supposedly, it could be, and the more controlled the intervention can be, meaning that the more likely that is going to be used. Because obviously, if you just completely, fuck people up as if they're just like lab rats, that won't go very well. So, in a sense, this stuff becoming safer is actually more dangerous, because the safer it becomes, the more likely we're going to be using it. Because the problem here isn't just, of course, about safety. The problem here is ontology. The problem here is ethics. The problem here is political, and so on and so forth. But from the scientific, medical, institutional standpoint, the problem is safety. Like that, all they care about is the fact that like what they're trying to do actually happens, rather than actually thinking about all these like larger consequences and effects of what they're doing, right? The more and like Fukuyama will point out here that even if the more extreme engineering part, like cloning or reverse aging or designer babies, even if this doesn't come to fruition, or is more moderate in how it comes to fruition, or takes a very, very long time, and so on, you're still going to have certain problems. So, for example, predictive embryonic selection is going to be, parents having kids, if you can screen for certain embryos which are going to have certain gene sequencing, which will be more likely to give them higher intelligence, or give them more likely to give them this or that, blah, blah, blah. There's going to be this whole almost like I know we selectively breed in the sense that we pick who we want to have a child with, but not selectively breed on that level. Like that level of control is going to be a big problem, even if something for a quote, even if it doesn't actually lead to crazy like wiring brains or cloning or something like that. So he says here, the first step toward giving parents greater control over the genetic makeup of their children will come not from genetic engineering, but from the pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and screening. In the future, it should be routinely possible for parents to have their embryos automatically screened for a wide variety of disorders, and those with the right, and he says right in brackets, genes implanted in the mother's womb. Present-day medical technology such as amniocentesis and sonograms gives parents a certain degree of choice already, and when a fetus diagnosed with Down syndrome is aborted, or when a girl's fetus are aborted in Asia. These are examples of that selective breeding and so on. So the two main forms this is going to come in, he says, are and like I'm not going to go into like the science of it because I don't really understand it, and it's not important for the sake of this video, but it's good to know these terms. Somatic gene therapy and germline engineering. And I think germline engineering is actually what they use with GMO crops, like manipulating GMO crops for all sorts of things, like to self-produce insecticides, or to not reproduce the seed so that you can monopolize it too. That's something else that's going on, and so on. This germline genetic modification is already going on with plants. There's that like we can clone animals. Like there was a sheep that was cloned, called Dolly. Yeah, he talks about it here. The other technology that's likely to mature, well-formed human genetic engineering, is human cloning. Ian Wilmot's success in creating the cloned sheep Dolly in 1997 provoked a huge amount of controversy and speculation about the possibility of cloning human beings from adult cells. President Clinton's request to the National Bioethics Advisory Commission for advice on this subject led to a study that recommended a ban on federal funding for human cloning research, a moratorium on such activities by private companies, and concerns and consideration by Congress on a legislative ban. In lieu of a congressional ban, however, the attempt to clone a human being by a non-federally funded organization remains illegal. There are reports that a sect called the Raelians is trying to do just that, as well as well-publicized efforts by Seravino and Antinori and Panos Zavos. I don't know who these people are. The technical obstacles to human cloning are substantially smaller than in the case of either pre-implantation diagnosis or genetic engineering, and have mostly to do with the safety and ethicality of experimenting with human beings. So the problem with human cloning, really, actually, because they have successfully cloned animals. So the problem with human cloning actually is more to do with the obvious political and ethical problems of doing it, rather than the actual scientific problems, is what he's saying. There's also the problem of side effects. So, genes have multiple functions. So, especially with immunological issues. So, for example, it's like someone has a gene which is more likely to give them, I think he mentioned sickle cell. But if you take out that gene, you may also be taking out the very thing which gives them an immunity to some other disease. So genes can have like susceptibility to one disease, and that very same gene can also contain the immunological protection against a different disease. So you take out one thing, you cause another problem. You fix one problem, you cause another problem. So there's this problem of genes having multiple functions and so on. He has a quote on that. Hold on. This is just a bit of a summary of these four categories. He says, first, even if genetic engineering never materializes, the first three stages of development in biotechnology, greater knowledge about genetic causation, neuropharmacology, and the prolongation of life, will all have important consequences for the politics of the 21st century. These developments will be hugely controversial because they will challenge dearly held notions of human equality and the capacity for moral choice. They will give societies new techniques for controlling the behavior of their citizens. They will change our understanding of human personality and identity. They will upend existing social hierarchies and affect the rate of intellectual, material, and political progress. They will affect the nature of global politics. The second point is that even if genetic engineering on a species level remains 25, 50, or 100 years away, it is by far the most consequential of all future developments in biotechnology. The reason for this is that human nature is fundamental to our notion of justice, morality, and the good life, and all of these will undergo a change if this technology becomes widespread. So that's just the four categories of this technology. It's not just genetic engineering, there's other things as well, which are there to think about. So I hope that was very helpful for anyone interested in this topic. Remember to subscribe if you haven't subscribed, and see ya.